The Mongols had destroyed Poland once before, and Poland let them do it again on purpose. That sentence should stop you cold, because if you know anything about the Mongol invasions of Europe, you know what happened in 1241. Legnica, the flower of European knighthood, torn apart in an afternoon. The great Duke Henry II of Silesia, his head on a Mongol pike, paraded around the walls of the city that bore his name. 100,000 dead across Poland and Hungary in a single campaign season. The greatest military machine the medieval world had ever seen, rolling west like a tide that could not be stopped. And then, inexplicably, it stopped. Not because it was beaten, because Ogedei Khan died and the generals rode home to elect a new ruler. Europe celebrated. The storm had passed. Poland rebuilt. The church called it a miracle. What nobody noticed, what historians have only begun to fully map in the last 30 years, is that Poland never forgot. The dukes and castellans who survived 1241 spent the next 4 decades quietly building something that looked, from the outside, like a fractured, squabbling patchwork of feudal territories. And it was. But it was also something else entirely. It was a killing ground. A system designed specifically to swallow a Mongol army whole and leave it with nothing to show for the effort. When Talabuga Khan and Nogai Khan rode into Poland in December 1287, at the head of somewhere between 40 and 55,000 horsemen, they expected another 1241. Total devastation, capitulation, plunder. They had done this before. To Russia, to Hungary, to Persia, to half of Asia, the formula never failed. Speed, terror, destruction, extraction. The cycle had worked for generations. This time, Poland was ready for the formula. What followed over the next 3 months was not a battle. It was an annihilation in slow motion, the systematic collapse of an army that could not find anything to eat, could not force the decisive engagement it needed, and could not turn back without admitting that the mightiest military power in the world had been neutralized by empty granaries and walls it could not break. The Mongols lost thousands of horses, tens of thousands of men, and, more consequentially, lost the psychological terror that had made their empire possible across half the known world. They never invaded Poland again, not once. The third Mongol invasion was the last Mongol invasion, and the reason they never tried again had almost nothing to do with courage or faith or divine intervention. It had to do with a set of decisions made by exhausted, unglamorous men in stone towers, rationing food and counting arrows, who had figured out the one thing the Mongols could not adapt to. They had figured out how to make victory impossible. This video is the story of how Poland engineered the defeat of the most dangerous army in the medieval world, not on a glorious open field, but in the cold, in the dark, and in the mud of a winter campaign that the Mongols walked into like a man stepping onto ice he could not see. By the end of this video, you will understand why the third Mongol invasion of Poland failed, not because of anything the Poles did in a single decisive moment, but because of everything they had built, planned, and sacrificed in the 46 years between Legnica and the winter of 1288. You will also understand something darker, the cost of that survival, and what it did to the people who paid for it with their lives and their homes and everything they had built. Before we ride into this campaign, every frozen ambush, every calculated sacrifice, every desperate decision made by exhausted men trying to hold a civilization together. If you are the kind of person who wants the real story of history, the tactics, the terrain, the blood and the frost, and the institutional genius buried under the legend, hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, because this story deserves to be told properly. And that is exactly what we are going to do. To understand 1288, you have to understand 1241. Not just what happened, but what it felt like to be alive in Europe the morning after Legnica. Because that fear, that specific texture of dread, is the engine that drove everything the Poles did over the next half-century. It is the soil that the trap of 1288 grew out of, fertilized by disaster and shaped by the peculiar, grinding intelligence of people who had survived the worst thing they could imagine and refused to let it happen again. The spring of 1241 had been, to European eyes, the end of the world. The Mongol armies had moved through Poland like wildfire through dry grass, and the speed of it, the absolute, bewildering, unprecedented speed, was as destructive as the violence itself. Medieval armies did not move like Mongol armies. A fully equipped European force of knights and infantry covered perhaps 15 miles a day on a good road in good weather. A Mongol tumen, a unit of 10,000 horse, covered 40, 50, sometimes 60 miles in a day, changing horses mid-march on a rotational system that meant the animals were never fully exhausted, eating in the saddle, sleeping in shifts, their supply needs met by the land they moved through, rather than by wagon trains crawling behind them. By the time a European commander understood where the enemy was somewhere else entirely. By the time the intelligence reached a duke or a bishop, the town the intelligence described was already ash. At the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241, Duke Henry II the Pious commanded a force that military historians have since estimated at somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men. Polish knights, Teutonic knights, Templar knights, German miners from Silesia, Bavarian infantry, and mercenary foot soldiers who had been gathered from across the region. By the standards of the day, this was a substantial army, a serious army, an army with real equipment and real fighting experience, and commanders who knew their craft. It was destroyed in detail before noon. The Mongol commanders, generals of Batu Khan, the cousins Kaidan and Orda, used the feigned retreat that had worked against enemies from the courts of northern China to the armies of the Abbasid Caliphate. Henry's cavalry pursued, the Mongol flanks closed, the Polish force was surrounded, pinned, and systematically massacred in a sequence that took less than 3 hours from the moment the Mongol lines first appeared to the moment the last organized resistance collapsed. 9 sacks were filled with ears cut from the dead. Henry II himself was identified by his wife not from his face, the state of his body did not permit it, but from a 6th toe on his left foot. That detail is not incidental. That detail tells you everything you need to know about the state of the corpse. 2 days later, and 300 miles to the south, at the Battle of Mohi on the Saho River, King Bela IV of Hungary suffered a defeat that makes Legnica look restrained. The Mongols bridged the river at night, caught the Hungarian camp still sleeping at dawn, and killed somewhere between 40 and 60,000 soldiers in a single engagement that lasted less than a day. Hungary as a functioning state ceased to exist for almost 2 years. Bela IV fled to the Adriatic coast and watched from the sea as his kingdom burned. The towns that were not burned were emptied by famine and plague in the aftermath. Contemporary chroniclers estimated that half the population of Hungary died in the invasion and the catastrophe that followed it. And then Ogadai Khan died of the drinking he had been doing since the campaign began, and the generals went home to elect a new ruler, and Europe prayed, and Poland buried its dead. And the survivors began the slow, grinding work of figuring out what had just happened and how to ensure it did not happen the same way again. What followed in Poland over the next 4 decades is one of the most important and least celebrated institutional responses to military catastrophe in the medieval world. And here is where the standard historical narrative goes deeply, badly wrong. The conventional account of Poland between 1241 and 1287 is a story of failure, political fragmentation, missed opportunities for unification, squabbling dukes who could not set aside their petty territorial ambitions long enough to build a coherent defense. The Kingdom of Poland that had existed under Casimir II and Leszek I was by the mid-13th century divided into a dozen competing principalities, each with its own duke, its own court, its own alliances and rivalries and church politics. There was no Polish king, there was no central military command, there was, from a certain perspective, barely a Poland at all. Just a geographic region occupied by Slavic-speaking people who happened to share a language and a faith, and a collective memory of national catastrophe. This narrative is not false. The fragmentation was real. The squabbling was constant and exhausting and often counterproductive. Polish dukes allied with Mongol vassals against each other. The PAS dynasty that had once unified the kingdom was dispersed across a dozen lines of descent, each convinced of its own prerogative and suspicious of every other. If you were looking at Poland from the outside in 1270 and trying to assess its military capability, you would have been right to be skeptical. But this narrative misses something essential. Fragmentation is not always a weakness. Sometimes it is precisely the right structural response to a particular kind of threat. A unified Poland with a single king and a single army and a single center of gravity was exactly what the Mongols were designed to destroy. Find the king, defeat his army, take the capital. The political structure collapses, the resistance collapses with it, and the plunder becomes accessible. This was how the Mongols had dismantled the Jin dynasty in northern China. It was how they had dismantled the Khwarezmian Empire. It was how they had dismantled the unified Russian principalities one by one. Find the center, break it, the periphery surrenders. There was no center in Poland to find and break. There were a dozen centers, each moderately defensible, none critical, none capable of surrendering on behalf of all the others. From a purely conventional military standpoint, this was a weakness. Against the specific Mongol operational model, it was an accidental advantage that Polish castellans and church administrators gradually learned to make structural. While the dukes were fighting each other, and they were constantly over territory and inheritance and ecclesiastical appointments and 100 other things that consumed the political energy of medieval aristocracy, something else was happening simultaneously and somewhat separately. Stone was being quarried and cut and hauled to hilltops across the length of Lesser Poland. In the region directly in the path of any invasion from the east, the number of fortified stone structures tripled between 1240 and 1280. Not wooden palisades, which burned. Not earthwork ramparts, which washed away and crumbled. Stone. Thick walls, deep wells, cellars packed with preserved food, permanent garrisons of trained soldiers who knew the ground around them and had nowhere else to be. The great castle at Sandomierz was rebuilt in stone after the Mongols burned its wooden predecessor in 1241. The fortifications at Krakow, the most strategically significant city in southern Poland, controlling the principal crossing of the Vistula River, received new outer walls, new towers positioned to cover the wall approaches, and a substantially strengthened citadel on Waddell Hill. Smaller castles and fortified towers went up throughout the river valleys and mountain passes of Lesser Poland, positioned to observe, to delay, to deny passage to forces that could not reduce them quickly. This building program was not random, and it was not purely the vanity of individual lords constructing impressive residences. It was coordinated by something more diffuse than a central authority, but more purposeful than accident. The collective institutional memory of men who had watched 1241 happen and drawn systematic, tactical conclusions. The castellans who built these fortresses had studied with the kind of grim attention that catastrophe forces on survivors exactly what the Mongols needed to operate and exactly what would deny it to them. And they had decades to translate those conclusions into stone and mortar. The defense they were constructing was not a wall. It was a network. And networks are, in the specific way that matters against a fast-moving enemy, fundamentally different from walls. A wall has a point. Break the point, bypass the wall, and you are through. A network has no point. It distributes the defender's capacity throughout the terrain in a way that forces the attacker to reduce or bypass every node before the territory is truly controlled. If you bypass the nodes, the castles, the fortified towns, you have an unprotected supply line and hostile forces at your back. If you reduce them one by one, you spend the campaign doing siege work in territory where every day costs you more than the defenders, because your supply situation is worse than theirs. The four principles of Polish defense by 1287 had emerged from this accumulated institutional learning. First, refuse battle in the open. Every engagement on flat ground, on a clear day, against a Mongol cavalry force of equal or greater size, was a lost engagement. This was not defeatism. It was data. The data from 1241 was unambiguous. Open field engagements against Mongol cavalry ended one way. Second, deny supply, strip the landscape, move the civilians, destroy the food, drive away the livestock. The Mongol operational model required living off the land. It was by design a low logistics, high plunder system that consumed the resources of the territory it moved through. Deny those resources, and you deny the system its fuel. Third, hold the fortifications regardless of cost. Every garrison that held behind an invader's advance was a constant threat to that advance's supply line and retreat route. A bypassed fortress was not neutralized, it was a slow poison. Fourth, harass without engaging, not pitched battle. Harassment, raids on foraging parties, ambushes in forest paths, night attacks on horse lines, operations designed to kill horses and exhausted men and supplies without ever presenting a target that a Mongol response force could destroy. These principles required something more difficult than courage. They required discipline, the ability to watch your town burn in the distance from behind castle walls and not open the gates to come out and fight. They required a specific kind of institutional faith. Faith that the system, executed properly, would produce a result that no single act of heroism could achieve alone. That is harder to ask of people than bravery. Bravery is instinctive. Disciplined restraint in the face of horror is learned, and it has to be maintained under conditions that make every instinct scream against it. Now, let us talk about the men who came in December 1287, expecting to collect what the system promised. Talabuga Khan was in his late 30s in 1287, a grandson of Batu Khan through the line that had inherited direct control of the Golden Horde, the western division of the Mongol Empire that stretched across the Eurasian steppe from the Carpathians to the Aral Sea. He was not unintelligent, but he was conventional in his expectations about how campaigns worked, and he had spent most of his life in a world where the Mongol operational formula produced the results the formula was designed to produce. He had a wide face, a close-cropped black beard beginning to show gray at the edges, and the slightly bulky build of a man who had spent decades on horseback. He wore a lamellar armor coat of overlapping steel and leather plates that had been made for him by craftsmen in Sarai, the Golden Horde's capital on the lower Volga, and it was heavy enough that it took 2 men to help him into it on campaign mornings when his joints were stiff from the cold. Nogai Khan was something else entirely. 15 years older than Talabuga, a commander with a battlefield record that stretched across the entire western Mongol sphere of operations. Nogai had fought in campaigns from Poland to Bulgaria to Byzantium and had developed, through that accumulated experience, an operational intuition that his younger co-commander notably lacked. He was leaner than Talabuga, harder in the face, with the narrow eyes and weathered skin of a man who had spent 6 decades outdoors in conditions that ranged from Pontic steppe summer to Russian winter to Carpathian mountain pass. He had his own territory, a semi-autonomous zone of the steppe between the Dnieper and the Danube that he administered with enough independence to make Talabuga perpetually, quietly furious. These 2 men did not trust each other. The joint command of the 1287 invasion was less a military arrangement than a political accommodation, a way of keeping both men in the operation so neither could claim the other had taken credit. It was, as divided commands almost always are, a structural weakness masquerading as a diplomatic solution. The combined force that crossed the Carpathians in early December 1287 was substantial by any measure. Contemporary Polish chronicles put the Mongol numbers at between 200,000 and 1 million, which tells you considerably more about the psychology of terror than about military demographics. Modern historians, working from logistical analysis and the capacity of the steppe territories to support horse armies of various sizes, estimate the core Mongol and allied Tatar cavalry at between 40 and 55,000, with additional contingents of Cuman light cavalry. Russian infantry pressed into service as laborers and auxiliary fighters, and a significant siege train, catapults, stone-throwing engines, the technical apparatus of siege warfare that the Mongols had imported from China and Persia and made their own over the preceding half-century. They expected Poland to behave the way it had in 1241. They had no reason to expect otherwise. The first indication that something was fundamentally different arrived within 2 weeks of crossing the frontier, in the territory around Lublin in the eastern reaches of Lesser Poland. The advance columns, pushing hard into Polish territory in the standard dispersed formation designed to maximize plunder gathering area while maintaining mutual support capability. found something that had no precedent in the Western campaigns. They found nothing, not ruined towns, empty ones, not dead livestock, absent livestock, not hidden grain, no grain at all. The food stores were gone. The wells were fouled in some locations, simply empty in others. The towns had been stripped to the walls, the population removed, the movable wealth taken away with them. Where in 1241, a Mongol raiding column could expect to eat well off the captured resources of the land it moved through. In 1288, the land itself had been emptied. Leszek II the Black, Duke of Krakow and the dominant political figure in Lesser Poland, had begun the evacuation and denial operation months before the invasion crossed the frontier. His intelligence network, built from merchants, clergy, border patrols, and the information systems maintained by the Polish churches, had given him adequate warning. The orders had gone out in the autumn, when the intelligence from the east suggested the invasion was being assembled. Strip the countryside. Drive the livestock east, away from the invasion's likely axis of advance. Fill the castle granaries to capacity. Garrison the fortresses with men who had been briefed, drilled, and psychologically prepared for extended siege conditions. Burn what could not be moved. The directive was brutally simple, and its execution, across the multiple jurisdictions of fragmented Lesser Poland, required the kind of organizational effort that does not appear in chronicles because it involved thousands of small, unglamorous decisions by village headmen and castle stewards, rather than dramatic gestures by armored knights. Leszek himself is worth spending a moment with, because the historical record has been unkind to him in ways that obscure how remarkable his achievement actually was. He was in his late 40s in 1287, ruling Krakow after a career in Polish ducal politics that had involved every variety of alliance, betrayal, dispossession, and recovery that the era afforded. He was called Black Czarny, possibly because of his dark complexion, possibly because of his reputation for ruthlessness, possibly both. He had, at various points in his career, been a subject of Mongol suzerainty himself, paying tribute to the Golden Horde as part of the complex web of political accommodation that kept Lesser Poland functional in a world where the Mongol Empire was the dominant power east of the Carpathians. He was not a pure resistance hero. He was a survivor and a pragmatist who understood power structures from the inside, including the one he was now preparing to resist. What he had, beyond political cunning, was institutional knowledge accumulated over a career spent watching what worked and what failed in the specific military environment of Central Europe in the shadow of the Mongol threat. He understood that the Mongols moved on plunder and that denying plunder was denying mobility. He understood that speed was their supreme advantage, and that fortification, not field armies, was the only reliable counter to speed. He understood that Polish knights fighting Mongol cavalry in the open was a formula for Polish defeat regardless of how good the knights were. Because the contest was not between the men, but between the operational systems, and the Polish operational system for open warfare was built for a different kind of enemy. He also understood something that is easy to overlook from the clean vantage point of historical analysis, but was psychologically brutal to execute in practice. That saving Poland required destroying it first. The civilians whose homes were burned to deny the Mongols supply. The village headmen who watched their stored grain, their entire food reserve for the winter, put to the torch because it could not be moved fast enough. The families who evacuated into the December cold with what they could carry on their backs, and the certain knowledge that whatever they were leaving behind would not be there when they came home. These people were not soldiers, and they were not volunteers. They were subjects, acting under orders, in a system that demanded enormous sacrifice from them in exchange for the somewhat abstract promise of collective survival. History celebrates the garrison commanders. It does not spend much time with the families evacuating in the snow. Both groups were essential to what happened in 1288, and only one of them gets memorialized. The Mongol columns pushed west, despite the absence of easy plunder. They had campaign supplies for several weeks, and they expected to make up the supply deficit once they reached the larger fortified towns, which surely could not all have been stripped. They moved toward Sandomierz in mid-December, the fortified city on the Vistula that controlled the primary river crossing in the center of Lesser Poland, and served as the gateway to Krakow's approaches. Here is where almost every account of the 1288 invasion goes badly wrong, and the error matters enormously because it shapes the entire understanding of how the campaign unfolded. The standard narrative, repeated in popular histories, echoed in documentary accounts, embedded in the conventional understanding of this period, states that the Mongols sacked Sandomierz. Several Polish chronicles of the period say so. A number of subsequent medieval histories repeat the claim. And it is wrong, or at least so dramatically incomplete as to be functionally misleading. What the Mongols burned in December 1287 was the lower town of Sandomierz, the unfortified civilian settlement that had grown up outside the castle walls over the preceding decades, and which had been largely evacuated before the Mongols arrived. The castle itself, sitting on its limestone promontory above the Vistula bend, its new stone walls reflecting the lessons of 1241, its garrison well supplied, and its defenders under orders to hold regardless of what happened below them. The castle did not fall. The chronicle accounts that describe Sandomierz as sacked are describing the burning of empty buildings. They are describing the destruction of things. They are not describing a military defeat, and that distinction is everything. The Mongol commanders sat outside Sandomierz for several days, applied probing pressure, assessed the walls, and made a calculation. Reducing this fortress to the point of submission would require weeks of systematic siege work, deploying catapults, cutting timber for siege towers, maintaining a stationary camp in deteriorating weather, all while supplies ran short, and the garrison above them made conditions as difficult as possible. The campaign's strategic objectives were not served by spending 3 weeks on a single fortress that controlled nothing essential to reaching Krakow. They bypassed Sandomierz and moved west. It was the correct tactical decision. It was strategically catastrophic, because Sandomierz sat at their back, intact, garrisoned, hostile, and perfectly positioned to harass any supply line or retreat route they left exposed behind them. Talabuga's columns pushed toward Krakow through the last days of December and into January 1288. Nogai's columns swept through different territory to the east and south, the standard Mongol division of forces designed to maximize coverage and overwhelm any attempt at concentrated defense. This separation was sound doctrine against the kind of opposition Poland had offered in 1241. Against the network defense Poland had spent 4 decades building, it meant the two commanders could not see each other's operations, could not coordinate their responses to unexpected resistance, and could not quickly support each other if one column ran into serious trouble. The guerrilla response that met Nogai's column in the forests of eastern Lesser Poland was the work of men who will never have statues raised in their honor. Armed bands, some regular soldiers from Castellan retinues, some levies called up from the defense network's village-level organizations, some simply local men with weapons and enough desperation to override their fear, operating from the tree line with specific practiced instructions. Do not engage Mongol columns in force. Target foraging parties. A foraging party is 10 to 30 men, separated from the main column, focused on searching for supplies that are no longer there. Hit it from the trees. Kill the men. Kill the horses. Disappear back into the forest before the response force arrives. Kill the horses above all else. The Mongol operational system was built on horses the way a modern armored force is built on fuel. And the Polish defenders understood this with the clarity that comes from having watched the system operate against them once before. A Mongol cavalry warrior without a horse was not a warrior. He was a slow, heavily armed man in a foreign country with no food. The horse population of the invasion force was the invasion force's real center of gravity, and the forest raids targeted it deliberately. This was not safe work. Mongol commanders who identified harassment activity responded with coordinated sweeps of the forest lines, cavalry columns pressing into the trees to flush out and destroy the bands operating against them. Some of the Polish fighters were caught. When they were caught, the Mongols did not take prisoners from common raiders. The fate of the bands that were overrun was not recorded because there was nobody left to record it. Villages that had not completed their evacuation and were found harboring fighters or simply present when the Mongol columns arrived were burned with their inhabitants. The winter of 1287 to 1288 was not survivable for everyone caught between the two sides. It was brutal for the Poles, in a way that the triumphant chronicle accounts of the campaign's outcome do not linger on, because it was the brutality of the side that ultimately won, and history tends to simplify the suffering of eventual victors. The men operating those forest bands were not soldiers in any formal sense that the knightly class of 13th century Europe would have recognized. They did not have feudal charters. They did not have heraldic devices. They did not receive land grants in exchange for military service in the way that armored cavalry did. They were, in most cases, the armed retinues of minor castellans and village headmen, supplemented by any able-bodied man in the surrounding area who had a weapon and understood what was at stake. Their tactics had been developed not through formal military training, but through a combination of the hunting practices of men who had spent their lives in these forests and the grim operational instruction that had been passed down through the defense network's informal systems since 1241. They knew where the deer paths went and where the river crossings were and where the tree line offered enough cover to approach a column's flank to within arrow range without being seen until the first shaft was already in the air. The Mongol riders who encountered these bands in the Polish forests were experiencing something that the Mongol military system, for all its extraordinary sophistication, had rarely confronted in this specific form. The Mongols had fought insurgencies before. They had crushed them, methodically, brutally, and completely, usually by applying enough punitive violence to the civilian population that the material and psychological base for continued resistance collapsed. In China, in Persia, in the Caucasus, this method had worked because the civilian population could not be fully evacuated and could not endure indefinite collective punishment. In Poland, in the winter of 1288, the civilian population had been evacuated. There was nothing to punish that had not already been removed, and the men in the forests had nothing left to lose that the Mongols had not already taken or burned. The punitive instrument that had suppressed insurgencies across the breadth of Asia did not work against people who had already accepted the loss of everything material. That specific condition, the condition of people who have stripped away their own vulnerability in advance of the threat, is one of the most difficult operational environments any army has ever had to navigate. You cannot terrorize people into compliance when they have already paid the price of resistance before you arrive to demand it. You can kill them. But killing them does not solve your supply problem or open the castles or give your horses something to eat. The Mongol columns in the Polish forests in January 1288 were fighting an enemy who had been robbed of everything that normally makes a civilian population controllable: property, family security, the threat of material loss, and who had nothing left to offer except continued resistance at whatever cost that resistance required. Talabuga arrived at the approaches to Krakow in January 1288 and encountered the thing that the 46 years of construction had been building toward. Krakow was not the city it had been in 1241. That city had been defended by wooden walls and prayers and had fallen in a day. This city had stone outer walls reinforced with towers, positioned at intervals that gave defenders overlapping fields of fire against any assault on the wall approaches. Wawel Castle, on its rocky promontory above the Vistula Bend, had been substantially rebuilt and strengthened. The city's internal water supply was drawn from wells inside the fortification perimeter and could not be cut off from outside. The garrison was substantial, trained, rested, operating on terrain it knew intimately, and under the command of men who had been briefed on exactly this scenario and had spent years preparing for it. What Talabuga saw when he looked at Krakow was not just a fortification. It was a statement about the last 46 years. Every stone in those walls was a decision that had been made after 1241, a decision to invest in permanence, to bet on the slow defense rather than the fast one, to accept the inconvenience and the expense of building something that could not be burned and could not be rushed and could not be panicked into opening its gates. It was, from a Mongol operational standpoint, almost philosophically offensive. The Mongols had built the largest empire in history on speed and maneuver and the principle that nothing should be fixed. Nothing should be static. Everything should be mobile and adaptable and responsive to opportunity. The walls of Krakow were the antithesis of every principle that had made the Mongol Empire possible. They were the deliberate, patient refusal of mobility. They were time turned into stone. Talabuga looked at Krakow and understood almost immediately that it could not be taken quickly. His siege equipment was present but not fully deployed. Moving heavy catapults over frozen Polish terrain in January was a logistical problem that took days to solve and produced machinery that was, in the specific terrain around Wawel Hill, less effective than the standard siege manual assumed. The fortification positions had been engineered with exactly this problem in mind. Talabuga could batter walls, and he could apply pressure, and he could demonstrate the terrifying spectacle of Mongol military power assembling at the city's gates. What he could not do, in his current supply situation, and given the defensive architecture in front of him, was take Krakow in the time frame the campaign required. He circled the city. He burned what he could reach in the surrounding area. He sent raiding parties north and west. He waited, apparently, for some development, some collapse of the defense network, some signal from Nogai's column that would make Krakow's position untenable without direct assault. The signal never came because Nogai was already dealing with a problem that would consume the rest of the campaign. This is where the story turns dark in a way that the triumphant Polish accounts do not spend much time examining. Nogai Khan had been right about the campaign's trajectory since at least late January. He had the operational experience to read the supply mathematics, and the supply mathematics were unforgiving. The horses were not finding adequate forage. The Mongol horse was an extraordinarily tough animal. The Mongolian pony was bred for conditions that would kill most other breeds, capable of surviving on minimal feed, capable of breaking through snow to find dried grass underneath. But in Poland's landscape, in the forested terrain of Lesser Poland, in a winter that was delivering consistent heavy snowfall, the horses could not graze effectively. The hay and grain that would normally have been available in barns and granaries throughout the region had been burned or taken away. The horse population was weakening. Some horses had already died. More would follow. Every dead horse was a reduction in the operational capacity of a force built entirely on horse mobility. Every horse that weakened was a horse that could not carry a warrior or pull a catapult or maintain the speed that was the Mongol force's entire tactical identity. Nogai understood this the way a general who has campaigned for decades understands the difference between a situation that is difficult and a situation that is deteriorating toward catastrophe. He began, in late January, to advocate for an early withdrawal. Take what they had accumulated, which was considerably less than the campaign had promised, but something, and go home before the horse losses became severe enough to impair the retreat. Cut the losses, preserve the force, come back in better conditions when the intelligence about Poland's defenses had been absorbed and the operational plan adjusted accordingly. Talabuga refused, or equivocated, which was worse. Returning without Krakow, without Sandomierz, without the kind of plunder and territorial demonstration that would justify the campaign to the Horde's political audiences, would be to return with nothing. It would be to hand Nogai the permanent political advantage of having been right about withdrawal, while Talabuga had been wrong about pushing on. In the politics of the Mongol Horde, where power derived entirely from military success and the ability to distribute its rewards, returning empty-handed was not just embarrassing. It was potentially fatal to Talabuga's position. Pride kept the army in Poland, pride in the political terror of admission, and while pride was being weighed against political survival, the horses kept dying, and the supplies kept dwindling, and the January cold pressed down on the steppe warriors from the south and made every morning of the campaign harder than the one before it. Sandomierz had not been quiet while this drama was playing out at Krakow's walls and in the tense spaces between the two commanders' councils of war. The garrison had been watching since December and conducting exactly the operations the defense doctrine called for. Raids against Mongol logistical elements moving through the territory between Sandomierz and Krakow, hit-and-run attacks on foraging parties, harassment of supply columns moving through the river valley below the castle's height. Smaller garrisons throughout the network were doing the same at their own scale, each adding its small increment of pressure to a system designed to make the accumulated weight of many small actions feel like one large and inescapable problem. The Poles were not winning any of these individual engagements. They were not supposed to. They were degrading, degrading the horse population, degrading the supply situation, degrading the morale of men who had come west expecting easy plunder and had found empty towns and hostile walls and forests full of invisible enemies who killed horses in the dark and were gone before dawn. There was a specific quality to this kind of warfare that is almost impossible to convey to someone who has not experienced it, but that every soldier who has fought in an insurgency against a guerrilla force operating in familiar terrain will recognize immediately. It is the exhaustion of being perpetually vulnerable. Without ever encountering an enemy, you can decisively engage. The Mongol warriors who rode out on foraging parties in the forests around Krakow in January 1288 knew that somewhere in those trees were men who intended to kill them. They could not see them. They could not hear them until the arrows came. They could not pursue them effectively through terrain that the Polish fighters knew and the Mongols did not. Every foraging trip was a potential ambush. Every return to camp was a small relief that did not erase the knowledge that tomorrow there would be another foraging trip, and another set of dark trees, and another uncertainty about whether this was the day. Someone did not come back. That kind of sustained operational stress does not appear in casualty figures. It appears in the diminishing willingness of men to ride out, in the tendency of foraging parties to stay closer to camp and return sooner, and find less, in the slow accumulation of decisions that make an army less capable than its nominal strength suggests. It was killing the Mongol force as surely as the cold was killing its horses, and it was doing so invisibly, which made it impossible to address directly. There is a concept in modern military theory called the culminating point, the moment in an offensive operation when the attacking force has expended enough of its momentum and resources that continuing to advance produces diminishing returns, and the balance of advantage begins to shift toward the defender. Every offensive has a culminating point. The skill of the defensive commander lies in understanding where that point is and ensuring that the attacking force reaches it before it reaches its objectives. The Polish defense in 1288 had been designed, whether consciously or through accumulated institutional wisdom, to move the Mongol army's culminating point as far forward as possible, to ensure that by the time the invasion ran out of the momentum that had carried it from the Volga to the Vistula, it was still short of the objectives that would have made the campaign worthwhile. Empty granaries and garrisoned walls did not stop the Mongol advance. They moved the line at which the advance became self-defeating. They changed where the culminating point fell. And the culminating point fell in front of Krakow in a Polish January. With the horses dying and the supplies gone, and nogai quietly calculating the cost of staying, and talabuga refusing to admit what the calculation showed. Talabuga gave the order to withdraw in early February 1288. He had not taken Krakow. He had not taken Sandomierz. He had burned a great deal of empty territory and killed a significant number of people, primarily civilians caught in the evacuation, or raiders caught in the forest. And he had accumulated a fraction of the plunder a campaign of this scale required to justify itself. The decision to withdraw was the right decision. It was made too late. The retreat was where the trap finally closed. A Mongol withdrawal under normal operational conditions was a disciplined, deadly operation. The Mongol forces knew how to break contact, how to screen a retreat with cavalry, how to move fast enough to prevent pursuit from gaining decisive ground, how to present a hostile rear face that discouraged any enemy commander from pressing too hard. In the campaigns of Genghis and his successors, armies that pursued retreating Mongol forces too aggressively had frequently found themselves being led into killing grounds where the retreat suddenly became a counterattack. The Mongol withdrawal was a weapon like any other part of their doctrine. What it required was horses that were healthy enough to move fast, and men who were not demoralized from weeks of cold and shortage and invisible harassment, and supply lines that had not been interdicted to the point of critical failure. By February 1288, the Mongol force in Poland did not have any of these things in adequate quantities. The weather hit them first. February in Lesser Poland delivered blizzard conditions that reduced visibility to 30 feet and turned the paths through the forested river valleys into sheets of ice that horses with weakened legs and poor forage could not navigate reliably. The retreat columns that had entered Poland in orderly formation began to fragment. Sections fell behind. Sections took wrong routes through terrain that had transformed from the landscape they had descended. into something they no longer recognized under 3 feet of new snow. Think about what it actually meant to be a Mongol warrior on that retreat, because the chronicles do not go there, and they should. You have been in Poland since December. That is 8 to 10 weeks of cold that exceeds anything the Pontic steppe delivers. Cold that seeps through the felt liners of your boots and the thick wool lining of your armor and settles into your joints by the 4th week and never fully leaves. Your horse, the animal that is as essential to your identity as your bow and your name, has been losing weight since January. You can feel it under you, the way the animal moves differently when it is working from reserves rather than from strength. You have been eating reduced rations since the 2nd week, because the plunder that was supposed to feed the campaign did not exist, and the campaign supplies that were supposed to tide you over until the plunder appeared ran low faster than the planning assumed. You have watched friends ride out on foraging parties and not come back. You do not know what happened to them in the forest with any certainty, but you know enough. And now the Khan has given the order to go home. And going home means crossing the Carpathians in February with a horse that might not make it, in conditions that are already worse than anything the campaign plan anticipated. This is where military forces break. Not in the dramatic moment of tactical defeat. That happens fast and clean compared to the slow grinding of a retreat through hostile terrain and deteriorating conditions with diminishing resources. The Mongol force that retreated through Poland in February 1288 was not routed. It was not chased from the field by a superior enemy. It disintegrated piece by piece, in the way that physically and psychologically exhausted forces disintegrate. Slowly, individually, each man and each horse and each unit becoming slightly less functional than it had been the day before, until the cumulative effect was an army that was, by the time it reached the passes, a fraction of what had crossed them going the other way. The harassment continued. The Sandomierz garrison had been waiting for this since December, and it moved against the retreating columns with the controlled aggression that the defense doctrine called for. Not pursuit to destruction, not the kind of pitched battle that would require them to fight in the open against an enemy that was damaged but not destroyed. Strikes against the flanks, raids on the wagon trains, cutting off the stragglers who fell behind the main columns in the confusion of the blizzard conditions. The accumulated plunder that the Mongols had gathered, not much, but some, became more contested on the retreat than it had been to acquire. The Polish raiders wanted it back. In some cases they got it. Not in a charge. Never in a charge. The garrison and the men who had been operating from the surrounding territory moved against the Mongol columns in the same mode they had been operating in all winter. Hit the flanks, target the wagon trains and the accumulated plunder, kill horses, disappear before the counterforce could organize. But now the counterforce was slower, and the Mongol columns were more fragmented, and the terrain advantage that the Poles had always had was amplified by the conditions to something close to absolute. The Carpathian passes in February were another kind of horror. The same mountains the invasion had descended in early December with relative ease had been transformed by winter into passages of killing cold and treacherous footing. The horses that had made the descent in reasonable condition could not negotiate the same passes loaded with plunder they had accumulated, depleted by weeks of inadequate feed, weakened by the cold that had been pressing on them since January. Contemporary accounts describe horses abandoned on mountain trails, equipment left in snowfields, men dying of exposure in places that should have been crossable by an army that was, in theory, accustomed to harsh winters. The Mongol horse was tougher than most breeds, but it was not invincible, and it had been pushed past the margin of its reserves. The disease that finished the calculation has never been fully documented, because the sources are fragmentary, and armies don't tend to record the unglamorous details of their own failures. But what we know from military history broadly is that armies operating in sustained cold conditions, with inadequate nutrition and inadequate shelter, under constant operational stress, suffer disease attrition at rates that dwarf battle casualties. The body under those conditions becomes an unreliable instrument. The immune system, compromised by weeks of cold stress and insufficient calories, cannot defend against the respiratory infections and gastrointestinal illnesses that move rapidly through men living in close proximity. A warrior who has been cold and hungry for 8 weeks and is now crossing a mountain pass in a February blizzard has very little reserve capacity to fight an infection that a healthy body would eliminate in 3 days. The disease burden on the retreating columns was real and substantial, and added to the accumulated losses that had been building since January. The men and horses that survived the Polish winter and the Carpathian retreat in the spring of 1288 were not the men and horses that had descended those same mountains in December. The army that emerged from Poland in the early spring was a damaged, diminished, shaken force that had accomplished almost nothing it set out to accomplish, at a cost that exceeded what anyone in the Mongol high command had anticipated. The precise casualty figures are unrecoverable from the available sources. Medieval chroniclers did not conduct actuarial analysis, and the Mongols themselves had institutional incentives to minimize the documentation of failure. What we can assess from the campaign's subsequent history is the effect. The Golden Horde's military activity in the years following 1288 turned inward rather than outward. The succession conflicts that consumed the 1290s were not caused by the Polish campaign alone, but a force that had returned from Poland intact and triumphant would have been much better positioned to project external power while managing internal politics. A force that returned damaged and empty-handed was a force whose Khan's political position was in immediate jeopardy and whose warriors' loyalty to that position was contingent on what he did next. What Talabuga did next was continue to lose until the losing cost him everything. The Golden Horde never launched another major invasion of Poland. They continued to raid, to apply political pressure through client rulers, to demand tribute and demonstrate the theoretical capacity for large-scale violence. But the kind of full-scale Western campaign that had terrorized Europe in 1241 and devastated Lesser Poland again in 1259 never materialized after 1288. The intelligence from the failed campaign had made it clear that Poland in 1288 was not Poland in 1241, and that the cost of another major invasion would exceed what any likely return could justify. The Polish defense system had done exactly what it was designed to do. The political aftermath of the campaign played out in ways that illuminate the internal dynamics of both the Mongol world and the Polish one. Talabuga's failure in Poland weakened him in the Golden Horde's succession politics in exactly the ways Nogai had anticipated it would. Nogai had been right. He had said so at the time in councils that Talabuga had overruled or ignored. In the merciless accountability of Mongol political culture, where status derived entirely from military success and the capacity to distribute its rewards, being wrong about a campaign that cost the Horde thousands of men and horses and returned almost nothing was a vulnerability that opponents would exploit without mercy. Talabuga was captured and executed, probably in 1291, by forces acting in Nogai's interest. The man whose pride had kept an army in Poland past the point where withdrawal was still clean, paid for that pride with his life. The Mongol world was not gentle with failure. Nogai himself reached the apex of his power in the decade following the Polish campaign, effectively dominating the Western steppe as a power independent enough to conduct his own foreign policy and impose his own political arrangements on the principalities around him. He was, genuinely, an extraordinary commander. The military assessment that he had given of the Polish campaign's trajectory in late January 1288 was exactly correct, and he had demonstrated throughout his career an analytical capacity for reading operational situations that his contemporaries rarely matched. But he could not outlast the system he was competing within. He was killed in 1299 by forces loyal to Tokhta Khan, who had consolidated enough power within the Horde to finally challenge the general who had dominated it for a decade. Another succession conflict. Another execution. The machinery ground everyone eventually. In Poland, the winter of 1288 left behind the kind of devastation that victory produces when the victory is the kind that requires destroying your own country to achieve it. The areas the Mongols had burned were burned regardless of the campaign's strategic outcome. The people who had died in the evacuation, the elderly who could not survive winter displacement, the children who did not make it to the castle walls, the fighters who were caught in the forest and did not come back, were dead regardless of whether the system they had served achieved its objectives. The economic recovery from the scorched earth defense took years. The human recovery from the grief of displacement and loss, and the specific trauma of watching your home burn in the middle distance from behind castle walls that you were not allowed to open, took a generation. The men who built this victory were not celebrated by the people who paid for it. They were survived by them, which is a different thing entirely. And surviving was, in the specific winter of 1288, everything. Leszek II the Black died in September 1288, 6 months after the Mongol withdrawal, apparently of natural causes. He had spent his career being called black, and being suspected, and being politically difficult, and being, when the moment required it, precisely the right man in precisely the right position, with precisely the right understanding of what the moment demanded. He left behind a lesser Poland that had held against the third and final Mongol invasion. He left behind a fortification network that would serve Polish defense for another generation. He left behind no major monument and no unified successor. His duchy fragmented again almost immediately after his death, the political accommodations that had sustained his rule dissolving without his presence to hold them. The dukes went back to squabbling. Nobody held a day of national mourning. Nobody built him a church. History moved on the way history always moves on, from the people who held something together precisely long enough for it to matter, and then died before the world they saved had time to recognize what they had been worth to it. But the Mongols did not come back. That is what 1288 accomplished. Not unification, not the birth of a new political order, not the dramatic, clean military victory that produces bronze statues and commemorative church windows, just the end of something that had terrorized a continent for half a century. The end of the existential threat. The quiet, brutal, extraordinarily expensive confirmation that if you build the right system and execute it with sufficient discipline, you can deny the most powerful military force in the world the conditions it needs to function. This is not the heroism that gets celebrated. It does not look like heroism at all, from close up. It looks like a woman carrying her children through a December snowstorm away from a town that is about to burn. It looks like a garrison commander telling his men for the 100th day in a row that they are going to hold, that the doctrine says to hold, that the holding is the victory, even when the burning is visible from the walls. It looks like a horse dying in a Carpathian snowdrift, with nobody watching who will ever write it down. The Mongol Empire that had destroyed and rebuilt itself across the better part of a century was, in 1288, already past its peak of coherence. The internal succession wars that consumed the Horde's energy in the 1290s were not caused by the Polish campaign, but the Polish campaign accelerated them. It weakened Talabuga, it elevated Nogai. It created the conditions for the political conflict that consumed both men. Poland was not the only place where the formula was failing, but it was the most complete and the most deliberate engineering of that failure. Other peoples had resisted the Mongols. Other fortifications had held, but nobody had built a system specifically calibrated to the Mongol operational model with quite the precision and quite the patience that Poland had. The final lesson of 1288 is not about Polish valor, though the valor was real and extraordinary. It is about the specific kind of intelligence that responds to catastrophic defeat not by vowing revenge, but by asking a much harder question. What does the enemy need, and how do we remove it? It is the intelligence that builds for 46 years and then trusts the building. It is the intelligence that watches its own country burn because the burning is the weapon and the weapon has to be used. There is something philosophically important in what Poland achieved that goes beyond the tactical and the strategic. The standard frame for understanding military success in the medieval period, and, if we are honest, in most periods, privileges the decisive moment, the great battle. The single commander whose genius turns the tide, the charge that breaks the line, the flanking maneuver that decides the campaign in an afternoon. This frame is not wrong exactly. Those moments exist and they matter, but they are the visible surface of something much larger, and the something much larger is what 1288 was actually about. Poland in 1288 did not win because of a decisive moment. It won because of the absence of decisive moments. Every decision Leszek's network made was aimed at denying the Mongols the conditions they needed to force a decisive engagement on their own terms. And the cumulative effect of that denial over 3 months was more destructive to the invasion than any single battle could have been. A battle can be won or lost. A system that works has no single point of failure. You cannot win decisively against a system that has been designed to absorb and deny rather than to meet and defeat. The Mongols had no experience with this specific architecture of resistance because no one in the Western territories they had previously encountered had understood their system well enough to engineer its inverse. There is also something worth sitting with about the role of time in this victory. The Mongols were fast. Speed was their strategic identity, their supreme advantage. The thing that had made the conquest of everything from the Sea of Japan to the Adriatic seem almost inevitable in the first half of the 13th century. Against speed, the conventional response is faster speed, and no European army could produce that. Poland's response was something entirely different. Instead of trying to compete with Mongol speed, they built something that did not care about speed at all. A network of stone that existed in a completely different temporal dimension from the Mongol operational model. The Mongols moved in weeks and months. The Polish fortification network had been building for decades. The Mongols could destroy a wooden wall in a day. They could not destroy a stone tower in a week or a month, or, as it turned out, an entire winter. Poland won not by being faster than the Mongols, but by being slower, by being permanent, by investing in things that did not move and could not be overrun by cavalry, and did not care how many horses the Golden Horde could put on the steppe. The Mongols could conquer armies. They could not conquer a people who understood their system better than their system had ever needed to understand itself, and who had built their resistance from the only material that the Mongol operational model could not consume: stone and patience and the institutional memory of catastrophe. That is what Poland built in the silence between invasions. That is what it used in the winter of 1288, and that quiet, terrible, enormously costly success is the reason that when you stand on Wawel Hill in Krakow today and look out over the city below, the spires and the river and the old market square, you are looking at a city that is still there because people who never made it into the chronicles stripped it bare and burned it themselves and held the walls and rode into forests to die in the dark so that the walls would still be standing in the spring. Some traps close in a single moment. Some take 46 years to set and an entire winter to spring. The best ones, the ones that work completely and permanently, look from the outside like nothing at all. Just an empty landscape, a stone wall, a cold wind, and an army that cannot find anything to eat. The Mongol horde never came back to find out if the trap was still set. It was. It always would have been.